Hello, neighbors. Before we get into the episode, just a couple quick things I'd like to mention. If you go to the podcast website, neighborontheleft.com, there's a whole bunch of things for you to check out there, including the contacts page, where you can see all of the social media links. And these days, I do post a lot of stuff just about daily on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. A lot of interesting stuff there. If you stop by, please like, share, and follow if you would. Also on the website, there is the episodes section where you can download or stream any episode of the podcast going all the way back to the beginning. And of course, the blog section. I make a post for every episode of the podcast, and it includes all of the sources that I use. All right, let's start the episode. Somewhere inside FBI headquarters in Washington was a secured room. Not a broom closet, not some forgotten basement storage cage. A SCIF, a sensitive, compartmented information facility, the kind of place built to handle classified material. And inside that room were filing cabinets, safes, boxes, burn bags, and potentially somewhere between around 950,000 and 1.9 million pages of government records stored there. Some of it was classified, some of it was related to politically explosive investigations, some of it still had to be digitized before the FBI could even determine what was responsive to a Freedom of Information Act request. And here's where this gets ridiculous. At the FBI's stated processing rate of 500 pages a month, even the lower end of that estimate works out to roughly 158 years. A century and a half. So, if you filed a request today, maybe tell your great-grandchildren to keep an eye on the mailbox. Now, before anybody starts drawing lines between push pins on a corkboard, let me put two things on the table. I have found no evidence that these records contain anything related to Jeffrey Epstein. And the fact that documents were found in burn bags does not, by itself, mean somebody was illegally destroying evidence. We're not going to invent a conspiracy here. Because we don't need one. What we actually know is strange enough. The FBI had an enormous volume of records sitting in a secured physical space. And a federal judge is now demanding answers about whether those records had been reviewed in response to earlier FOIA requests and whether copies exist somewhere else in the FBI's record systems. And all of this is happening at a moment when the Justice Department and the FBI are already asking the public to swallow a hell of a lot as far as trust is concerned. So that's the question that I want to start with. When the FBI tells us we searched our records, what exactly does that mean? Hello, neighbors. You're listening to a Friday edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left, a podcast about progressive politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, your host. Today, we're talking about what's been called the FBI's burn bag room. But this isn't really a story about burn bags. It's more a story about trust. How government records are kept, how they're searched, how the public gets access to them, and what happens when records physically exist, but may not be sitting where the systems designed to find them would expect them to be. Because transparency isn't just about whether the government is willing to hand over a document. First, the government has to know the document exists. It has to know where it is, and it has to have a system reliable enough that when somebody says, "We searched everything," the rest of us have some reason to believe that actually means something. That's where this gets a lot bigger than one room inside the FBI. So let's slow this down and separate the weird from the important. The room was room 9582 inside FBI headquarters in Washington. It was, as I said, a SCIF, a secured space designed for handling classified information. According to a government filing in the James Comey case, FBI investigators were alerted to the room in the spring of 2025 while reviewing FBI policies, procedures, compliance, and culture. The government described it as a seemingly unused SCIF containing what it called a random collection of classified documents. A large majority of those documents were reportedly sitting on the floor inside 5 burn bags. Investigators inventoried the room. They found hundreds of pages connected to Crossfire Hurricane, the FBI's 2016 investigation into possible ties between the Trump campaign and Russia, along with material from the then classified appendix to John Durham's special counsel report. Inside a locked safe, they also found copies of handwritten notes from James Comey's time as FBI director. Now, here's where the scale changes completely. In a separate FOIA case, DOJ told the court that the room contained several 5-drawer filing cabinets holding records that still needed to be digitized before the FBI could even determine what was responsive to the request. The estimate? Somewhere between roughly 950,000 and 1.9 million pages. And that number is not necessarily the number of responsive documents. It's the estimated volume that had to be digitized and then reviewed. The filing describes some of the material as older, quote, legacy files, mostly tied to 2 closed historical investigations, along with more recent records connected to active investigations. So these records were not necessarily lost. They were physically there. The real question is whether the systems people relied on to find FBI records knew they were there. And that distinction between possessing a record and being able to find it is where this story really begins. So before we go any further, let's make sure we're all speaking the same language. You hear about FOIA requests all the time. So just a quick primer. FOIA stands for Freedom of Information Act. It's the federal law that gives the public the right to request records from executive branch agencies. Journalists use it, advocacy groups use it, researchers use it, and ordinary citizens can use it. And the basic idea is pretty simple. Government records belong, in a very real sense, to the public, unless there is a lawful reason they can't be released. Now, FOIA does not mean you send the FBI a question like, hey, what really happened here? And somebody has to type up an answer. You're requesting existing records, emails, memos, reports, correspondence, investigative files, whatever records fall within the scope of your request. The agency then has to figure out where the records responsive to that request would reasonably be expected to exist, search those places, review what it finds, and determine what can legally be released. And not everything can be. FOIA has 9 exemptions covering things like classified national security information, personal privacy, certain law enforcement material, privileged communications, and other protected categories. So sometimes you get the record, sometimes you get the record with half the page redacted, looking like somebody attacked it with a Sharpie. And sometimes the government just legally withholds the document altogether. But here's the part that matters for our story. There is no magical FOIA computer at the Justice Department where somebody types in your request into a search bar and then every relevant piece of paper in the federal government pops up in the search results. Each agency searches the record systems, offices, custodians, and locations reasonably likely to contain what you asked for. That is the standard, a reasonable search. And that means the quality of the answer depends, at least in part, on knowing where the records are. Because if the system doesn't know where to look, FOIA can't magically know either. So now let's talk about the phrase that makes this whole story sound like somebody greenlit a bad political thriller. Burn bag. I mean, that sounds ominous as hell, but a burn bag is not by itself evidence of anything illegal. In classified environments, sensitive material that has been designated for secure destruction has to be handled carefully until it can actually be destroyed. Federal security rules allow classified paper to be destroyed by approved methods like burning, shredding, pulping, pulverizing. So the existence of a burn bag is not in and of itself suspicious. It is it's part of the security process. The question is what these particular records were doing inside the burn bags. Were they actually designated for destruction? Had copies already been preserved somewhere else? Were the bags being used temporarily while somebody sorted material? Had the proper records retention rules been followed? I don't know. And unless the records or the court tells us otherwise, neither does anybody yelling cover up on social media. That distinction matters because there is a huge difference between saying documents were found inside burn bags and saying the FBI was caught trying to destroy evidence. The first statement is documented fact. The second requires evidence that we don't currently have. But once you clear away the spooky language, we're still left with the interesting part. Why were important federal records sitting there in the first place? And more importantly, if they were sitting there, how easily would they have been to find? This is the part that sounds impossible until you think about how government records actually accumulate. Not everything is born digital. Some records begin as paper. Some live in old case files. Some sit in classified systems. Some are scanned. Some are indexed. Some are copied into other databases. Some belong to investigations that were closed a long time ago and were built under completely different filing systems. And over time, all of that becomes what bureaucracies politely refer to as legacy records, which is basically a nice way of saying old stuff that doesn't always play nicely with the new stuff. And that matters because a record can physically exist and still not be easy to find. Imagine a document sitting in a filing cabinet in a secured room. Now, it hasn't vanished. Nobody shredded it. Nobody burned it. But if the electronic index used by the people conducting the record search doesn't point to that cabinet or doesn't reflect that document at all, then functionally speaking, for the purpose of that search, it becomes pretty much invisible. That doesn't automatically mean somebody hid it. It can mean poor indexing or old systems, bad records management, incomplete digitization, a file sitting somewhere nobody expected to look. And that distinction is incredibly important. We tend to think of missing records as documents that have literally disappeared, but that's not the only way records can fail. A document doesn't have to disappear to become effectively invisible. And when you're talking about hundreds of thousands, potentially more than 1 million pages of government material, that becomes more than a filing problem. It becomes an accountability problem. Because if the government possesses a record but can't reliably surface it when somebody asks for it, then for the person on the outside, what exactly is the difference between we don't have it and we have it but our system doesn't know where it is? This is where the FOIA piece stops being procedural and starts being, uncomfortable. When an agency tells a court or a requester, we conducted a search, that doesn't necessarily mean somebody literally searched every office and hard drive and filing cabinet and safe and archive box and storage room that the federal government owns. The legal standard is generally whether the agency conducted a reasonable search, whether it looked in the places where responsive records would reasonably be expected to be found. And most of the time, that makes total sense. You don't search the cafeteria refrigerator for classified investigative files. You search the systems, offices, custodians, and record locations connected to the subject. But here's the problem. That process assumes the agency has a reasonably accurate map of its own records. So when the government says, our search did not locate responsive records, most people hear, those records don't exist. those are not always the same thing. Because if a relevant record is sitting in an unexpected physical location or in a legacy file that isn't reflected in the systems being searched, then a search can be reasonable and still fail to find it. And that is why this FBI room matters. Not because its existence proves previous FOIA searches were bogus, it doesn't. But because it raises the exact question you would want answered. Were these records represented in the systems the FBI had been relying on? Were copies indexed somewhere else? Had earlier searches already captured them? Or were there records sitting physically inside FBI headquarters that previous searches simply had no reason to surface? And those are not conspiracy questions. Those are records management questions. And now they're not just my questions. They're the court's questions too. Now, none of what we've talked about so far is uniquely a Trump problem. Government records get screwed up, and FOIA backlogs are old, bureaucracies are messy. However, context matters, and this story is landing inside a Justice Department that has spent the last year and a half making public trust harder, not easier. Start with the basic posture. Donald Trump came back into office promising to end what he called the weaponization of the Justice Department. Then his administration immediately began reshaping the department around, or supposedly around, that very idea. Officials were pushed out or resigned. Prosecutors and FBI personnel connected to January 6th cases came under scrutiny. In New York, multiple senior Justice Department officials resigned rather than carry out an order to drop the corruption case against Mayor Eric Adams. And since then, the department has pursued or investigated a remarkable list of people that Trump has publicly attacked. James Comey, Letitia James, John Brennan, others tied to investigations Trump has spent years referring to as corrupt. Now, that does not mean every one of those investigations is illegitimate. That distinction matters. If somebody committed a crime, being Donald Trump's enemy doesn't grant them immunity. However, when a president publicly demands investigations of his critics, senior officials use openly political language about enemies and weaponization, and the Justice Department then starts investigating those same people, the public is entitled to notice the pattern. And the courts have noticed problems too. Just this month, a federal appeals court upheld a block on Justice Department subpoenas aimed at Letitia James' office because the Trump-aligned prosecutor who issued them was serving unlawfully after his interim appointment had expired. Again, none of that tells us anything about what happened in this FBI room, but credibility works sort of like a bank account. You build it slowly. You spend it every time an official makes a sweeping promise that later gets revised. You spend it when law enforcement starts sounding like campaign messaging, and you spend it when the line between prosecution and political grievance gets blurry enough that courts and career officials and the public are arguing about whether it exists at all. And eventually somebody comes along and says, trust us, we looked. Well, that statement does not arrive on a blank sheet of paper. It arrives with everything that came before it. So I'm not saying the Trump Justice Department hid these records. I'm saying this administration has made the phrase trust us a much harder sell. And when the subject is whether the FBI actually knows where all of its own records are, that credibility deficit matters greatly. And then, we have to talk about Kash Patel. Oh, Kash. Because institutions don't communicate with the public in some vacuum. They communicate through people. And the person currently asking Americans to trust the FBI is a man whose public persona is not exactly understated. Patel likes declarations. This is what real leadership looks like, or the mission has never been better. Criticism of him is always baseless, fraudulent, false. There's a whole lot of certainty, a whole lot of swagger, a lot of chest out, everything is going to be great language from this guy. And here's my problem with that, or one of my problems with that. Confidence and bravado are not the same thing. The director of the FBI does not need to sound like a campaign surrogate. He needs to sound like the guy who has read the binder twice. Because this is an institution handling classified material, counterintelligence, public corruption, terrorism, politically sensitive investigations, and records that may become evidence years from now. I mean, you want boring. Boring is good. Boring says the procedures work whether the cameras are there or not. Instead, Patel has spent part of his tenure fighting highly public, personal battles with critics. He sued former FBI official Frank Figliuzzi over statements about his conduct. Then in April, he filed a $250 million defamation lawsuit against The Atlantic over a story alleging Patel's excessive drinking, unexplained absences, and leadership problems inside the Bureau. Patel, of course, says those allegations are false. The FBI and Justice Department denied them before publication of the article. The Atlantic insists that it's standing by its reporting. And I'm not going to settle that dispute today sitting at my microphone. I don't know whether those allegations are true, but that is almost the point I'm making. Look at the fog surrounding the person running the FBI. Allegation, denial, lawsuit, counterattack, another accusation, another declaration that everything is just peachy keen. None of that proves anything about the records in this room, nothing, but it absolutely affects the environment in which the FBI, in which their assurances are being received. When an institution says to you, trust our process, the public is also judging the people running that process. And right now, the problem isn't that we can prove something sinister is hiding in the fog. The problem is that there shouldn't be this much fog around the institution in the first place. And this, of course, leads us to Jeffrey Epstein. This is where this guy has to enter the conversation. And not because I think the files in that FBI room are Epstein files. I don't. I've found nothing that leads me to believe there's a connection between that room and the Epstein files. The reason Epstein matters here is because it gives us a very recent example of exactly the problem that we've been talking about. How do you know when you actually have everything? In February of 2025, Attorney General Pam Bondi said she asked for the full and complete Epstein files. She received about 200 pages. And according to Bondi's own letter to Kash Patel, she repeatedly asked whether that was everything. She said that she was repeatedly assured that it was everything. And then she learned that the FBI field office in New York had thousands of additional pages. I mean, think about that for a moment. The Attorney General of the United States was asking whether she had a complete set of records. She was told she did and apparently didn't. Later, DOJ and the FBI said they conducted what they called an exhaustive review of Epstein-related holdings. That review involved digital searches, hard drives, network drives, locked cabinets, desks, closets, the whole shebang. Then Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act, and by January of this year, DOJ said it had released nearly 3.5 million pages. Now, none of that proves somebody deliberately hid something, and it certainly does not prove those records have anything to do with the room that we're talking about today, but it illustrates the problem perfectly. If the Attorney General can be told, yep, that's the full set, and then discover that thousands of additional pages exist somewhere, why should the rest of us hear the phrase, that's everything, as though it's somehow self-proving? That's the connection. Not Epstein conspiracy, not secret client lists and burn bags, but institutional confidence. Before the public can trust the government when it says, we found everything, The government has to actually know where everything is. And now the court is asking the same basic questions. Judge Dabney Friedrich has ordered the parties to report back by September 4th. And she wants the government to answer three things in particular. First, were these legacy records or newer records ever previously considered or reviewed in response to other FOIA requests? Second, do these records also exist somewhere else in another FBI records system or index? And third, can the government provide more information about the two historical investigations represented in those legacy files? That is the heart of what I'm talking about today, because there is a massive difference between these papers happen to be sitting in a weird room, but the records were already properly indexed and searchable elsewhere. And on the other hand, these papers existed physically, but previous record searches may not have known they were even there. One would make this story considerably less alarming. The other should raise some very serious concerns. And right now, the court is trying to determine which situation we're actually dealing with. That's why I don't want to get ahead of the evidence. The judge hasn't declared a cover-up. She hasn't ruled that prior FOIA searches were inadequate. She's asking the government to explain what happened. And frankly, those answers matter a hell of a lot more than whatever somebody on social media has already decided happened inside that room. And now we get to the number that makes this whole thing sound like satire. 158 years. That estimate comes from the lower end of the FBI's own page count range. Take roughly 950,000 pages, process them at 500 pages a month. That's 1,900 months, or about 158 years. And remember, that's using the lower estimate, not the 1.9 million page upper end of the estimate. So no, a judge did not literally sentence Judicial Watch to wait until, the 22nd century. This is what happens when an enormous paper backlog collides with a painfully slow processing rate. But still, come on. Public records law is supposed to give the public meaningful access to government records. If the answer is technically, yeah, sure, you can have them, what are you doing around the year 2184? If that's the case, transparency is theoretical, not practical. Now, to be fair, FOIA backlogs did not begin with this administration by any means. Agencies have struggled with enormous caseloads and complicated reviews, classification issues, staffing shortages, and ancient record systems for years. This is a structural problem. But this particular example takes that structural problem and puts it under stadium lighting. Because a right to government information does not mean very much if the process for getting it operates on a longer timeline than several human lives. And this is not the first time government records themselves have become part of the story. Watergate gave us the most famous example. An 18.5-minute section of a White House tape was erased. Richard Nixon's secretary, Rose Mary Woods, said she accidentally erased part of it. Investigators never established exactly how the gap actually happened. And because that missing audio sat right in the middle of one of the biggest political scandals in American history, the absence itself became evidence that people obsessed over. Then there's the CIA interrogation videotape scandal. That one was different. In 2005, the CIA deliberately destroyed videotapes showing interrogations of terrorism suspects. Those tapes were gone on purpose. That sparked years of investigations and arguments over who authorized the destruction, what legal obligations existed, and whether evidence relevant to court cases and congressional inquiries had been wiped out. Then fast forward to January 6th. The Secret Service later acknowledged that text messages from January 5th and 6th, 2021 had been erased during a planned device replacement program. The agency said the deletions were part of a technology migration that happened before an inspector general requested the messages. That's not the same thing as those CIA tapes, and neither one is the same thing as Watergate. Different mechanisms, different levels of intent, different kinds of failure. And our current FBI story may be different again. The records we're talking about may not have been destroyed at all. They may have been sitting there the whole time, which gets us back to the central point. Government records can fail in more than one way. They can be erased, they can be deliberately destroyed, they can disappear during a technology transition, or they can physically exist while becoming difficult enough to locate that for practical purposes, they fall outside the normal path of accountability. And every one of those failures matters for the same reason. If we cannot reconstruct what government did, we cannot effectively hold government responsible for what it did. And this is where the story gets bigger than FOIA, and bigger than one room, and bigger than one administration. Transparency requires at least three things: preservation, the record has to survive; discoverability, the government has to know where it is and be able to find it; and third, good faith disclosure. Once the record is located, officials have to follow the law and release what the public is entitled to see. If any one of those breaks down, transparency breaks down with it. And when leadership has already damaged public confidence in that third piece, whether officials are being candid or even-handed, problems with the first two become harder to shrug off. Because government records are not just paperwork. They are institutional memory. They are how we reconstruct decisions after the people who made them have moved on. They are how journalists test official stories, how Congress conducts oversight, how courts determine what actually happened, how citizens figure out whether power was used lawfully. And that means records management is not just some dusty administrative side issue. It's part of accountability itself. If the government cannot preserve the record, find the record, and convincingly explain what it has done with the record, then eventually the problem is not just that we can't see the paperwork. The problem is that we lose the ability to know what our government did. So go back to that room, the filing cabinets, the safes, the boxes, the burn bags, potentially close to 2 million pages of government records, and enough uncertainty surrounding all of it that a federal judge now wants the government to explain what had been searched before, what exists somewhere else, and what those records actually represent. Maybe the answers turn out to be reassuring. I hope that's the case. But this is the point. Government transparency does not begin when somebody files a FOIA request. It begins years earlier with preserving the record, cataloging it, knowing where it is, building systems that can actually find it, and maintaining institutions credible enough that when they say to us, we looked, we have some reason to believe them. Right now, every one of those things deserves scrutiny, because when the government says, we searched, that's everything, the public has every right to ask one more question. How do you know? All right, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this installment of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. I'm thrilled that you did, and I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this subject and any other subject for that matter. At the beginning of the episode, I mentioned how you can get in touch with the podcast, whether it's through DMs on social media or the email address. Either one is fine. Hope to hear from you soon. It's Friday, so the weekend is here. We'll be back on Monday with another full episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, do me a favor, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of weekend you'd wish for others.